There are stories that history whispers only to those who listen closely. Tales of rulers whose power flowed not like thunder across mountains, but like morning mist through valleys, touching everything, changing everything, yet leaving no sharp edges in memory's gentle archive. Tonight we discover such a presence, a queen whose name the chronicles barely caught, like trying to hold moonlight in cupped palms, yet whose influence wrapped around her kingdom like the softest wool cloak on a winter's evening. Whether you're nestled in mountains where snow is beginning to dust the peaks, or near the sea where waves are writing their eternal stories on sandy shores, or perhaps in a city where lights are beginning to dim one by one like stars appearing in rivers. I hope you've found that perfect spot where your body can truly rest. Maybe you've adjusted your pillow just right, pulled your blanket up to that exact comfortable height. If this gentle tale brings you even a moment of peace tonight, a soft like helps other weary souls find their way to rest too, let your shoulders soften now, feeling how they've been carrying today's invisible weight, and as they release, notice how your breath naturally deepens, becoming slower, more rhythmic, like waves on a distant shore. The day is dissolving behind you, its edges becoming soft and indistinct, while ahead lies only this quiet journey into a story that asks nothing of you except to listen or to drift, whichever feels more natural. Time is gently carrying us backward now, through layers of centuries that fold away like pages in an ancient book, until we arrive in a small kingdom whose name itself has grown soft with age. In the year when spring flowers bloomed earlier than anyone could remember, when the old stone castle on the hillside caught morning light like honey pooling in carved hollows, there lived a queen whose voice was so gentle that servants had to lean close to hear her words. Queen Elisande, though even her name was written differently in every document, sometimes Elisande, sometimes Elisandra, as if the scribes themselves could never quite capture the quiet melody of who she was. The castle where she reigned sat like a sleeping cat upon its hill, its grey stones warmed by centuries of sun, its towers reaching upward not in defiance but in gentle aspiration. From the highest window, where Elisande often stood in early morning hours, you could see the entire valley spreading like a rumpled quilt, fields of barley shifting from green to gold depending on the season's patient hand, villages tucked into hillside folds where smoke rose from chimneys in thin ribbons that disappeared into morning air. But we're moving too quickly. Let's drift backward to understand how a girl who spoke in whispers became a queen who ruled in silence. Elisande's childhood unfolded in a manor house, 3 days' ride from any proper town, where silence wasn't emptiness but fullness, like a cup brimming with clear water. Her father was a minor lord who collected books the way others collected gold, filling room after room with volumes that smelled of leather and old parchment, of distant places and forgotten wisdom. Her mother had passed when Elisande was still small enough to fit in the window seat of the sola, leaving behind only the faintest memory of lavender water and lullabies hummed in a voice soft as dove feathers. The child grew among these books like a plant reaching toward whatever light he could find, learning to read by tracing her small fingers under words while her father's voice rumbled gently above her, explaining how Latin curved differently than their own tongue, how numbers could tell stories just as surely as words, how maps were really invitations to dream about places where different stars watched over different souls in those early years, which passed like clouds across a summer sky, unhurried and ever changing. Elisan discovered that she could hear things others missed, not supernatural things, nothing that would alarm the church or invite suspicion, but subtle things. The way a servant's breath caught when certain names were mentioned, telling her where alliances truly lay. The particular quality of silence that fell when people were hiding worry versus when they were hiding joy. The rhythm of footsteps that revealed whether someone approached with honest intentions or careful deception. Her education was unusual for a girl of even minor nobility. Her father, perhaps seeing something in those grey eyes that watched everything while seeming to look at nothing in particular, insisted she learn alongside her brothers. So she studied arithmetic by candlelight that made numbers dance gently on the page, traced maps where sea monsters decorated unknown waters with less fear than promise, read histories where queens and abbesses shaped kingdoms through wisdom rather than warfare. The seasons turned their great wheel, and Elisander grew like a tree that bends with wind rather than standing rigid against it. By her 14th winter, when frost painted delicate feathers on window glass each morning, she could speak 4 languages but rarely raised her voice above the volume of falling snow. She could calculate the contents of granaries and the cost of maintaining soldiers, but preferred to work these problems while sitting in the garden where roses climbed ancient walls, their thorns softened by age and patient tending. It was in her 16th year that the message came, carried by riders whose horses breathed steam into cold morning air. The king sought a bride for his eldest son, Prince Roderick of the Eastern Marches, and Elisander's peculiar education, her gentle bearing, her family's distant but legitimate connection to royal blood. All of these threads wove together into an opportunity that arrived like unexpected rain after a long drought. The journey to the capital took 12 days, each one bleeding into the next like watercolors left in gentle rain. The carriage rocked with a rhythm that made thinking feel like floating, and Elisand watched the landscape change through windows filmed with road dust. Forests giving way to fields, fields to towns, towns to the great city that sprawled around the royal castle like a living thing that had grown rather than been built. Prince Roderick was 23, with hair the color of autumn wheat and hands that moved constantly, as if he were conducting invisible music. Their first meeting took place in the castle's summer garden, where fountains whispered secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. He spoke of hunting and tournaments, of border disputes and trade routes, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly denied anything. Meanwhile, Elisand listened with the quality of attention that made people feel truly heard, perhaps for the first time. And when she did speak, her words were so carefully chosen, so soft that Roderick found himself leaning forward, drawn into an intimacy he hadn't expected. The wedding took place when cherry blossoms were falling like snow that would never feel cold. The cathedral bells rang out across the city, but even their bronze voices seemed gentled by the spring air, warm and thick with the promise of summer. Elisande wore a gown of blue so pale it might have been woven from sky. And when she spoke her vows, only those closest to the altar could hear the words, though everyone could see the way Roderick's face softened, as if he were discovering something precious he hadn't known he was looking for. Their early married life unfolded in the eastern wing of the castle, in rooms where tapestries depicted unicorns resting in moonlit glades, where windows faced the sunrise and caught first light like vessels filling with golden wine. Roderick would leave early for council meetings, for military exercises, for the 100 duties that pulled a prince in every direction, while Elisande remained, reading, writing letters in her careful hand, speaking with servants in tones so gentle they forgot they were being questioned. It was during these quiet months that she began to understand the true shape of the kingdom, not from maps or proclamations, but from the worried whispers of laundresses, the careful words of stable boys, the things that merchants mentioned while thinking no one important was listening. The kingdom was like a tapestry whose front showed a glorious scene, but whose back revealed all the knots and tangles that held the picture together. And some of those threads were beginning to fray. When young Prince Adrian was born, arriving with the first snows of winter, the kingdom rejoiced with bonfires that dotted the hills like fallen stars. But Elisande's joy was quiet, internal, like a candle flame protected from wind by cupped hands. She would sit for hours in the nursery, holding this small life while snow fell past windows, singing lullabies in a voice only the baby could hear. Songs her own mother had hummed in that half-remembered time before memory truly began. Roderick grew more distant as responsibilities multiplied, leading armies to defend borders that seemed to shift like smoke, negotiating with merchants whose smiles never quite reached their eyes, attending feasts where wine flowed freely and promises were made that everyone knew would dissolve by morning. He would return to their chambers late, sometimes stumbling, sometimes silent, and Elisande would help him to bed without reproach. Her hands gentle as she removed his boots, her voice soft as she assured him that tomorrow would be kinder. But tomorrow arrived wearing black, bringing news that changed everything with the quiet finality of a door closing in an empty house. The hunting accident happened on a day when autumn was painting the forests in shades of rust and gold, when morning mist clung to valleys like the earth's own breath made visible. They said Roderick's horse had startled at something, a rabbit perhaps, or just a shadow that looked wrong in the slanted light. He fell badly. And by the time they carried him back to the castle, the sun was setting and the priest was already whispering last rites into air that smelled of coming rain. Elisande sat beside her husband's bed for 3 days, watching his chest rise and fall with increasing difficulty, like waves growing smaller as they traveled farther from their source. When he finally slipped away, it was in the grey hour before dawn, that time when the world seems to hold its breath, waiting to see what the new day will bring. She closed his eyes with fingers that didn't tremble, though something inside her shifted, settled, like sediment in disturbed water finally finding stillness. Prince Adrian was barely 3 years old, too young to understand why everyone spoke in whispers now, Why his mother wore colors like twilight. Why his father's chair at the great table remained empty but somehow still present, like an echo of authority that hadn't quite faded. By law and custom, Elisande became regent, holding the kingdom in trust for her son until he would come of age, 15 years hence. 15 years that stretched ahead like a road, disappearing into mist. The lords of the council expected her to be a figurehead, a signature on documents they would prepare, a gentle voice that would agree to whatever they deemed best. They addressed her with elaborate courtesy that barely concealed their assumption that real power would flow around her like water around a stone, finding its own level in their capable hands. But Elisande had spent years learning to read the unspoken language of power, the way it moved through rooms like heat, invisible but undeniable, warming some while leaving others in shadow. She attended every council meeting, sitting in a chair placed slightly behind and to the left of where the king would have sat, dressed in grey wool that made her seem part of the stone walls themselves, speaking so rarely that when she did, the unexpectedness of it made everyone pause. Her method was like water working on stone, patient, persistent, almost imperceptible. When Lord Garrett proposed raising taxes on the Millers Guild to fund new fortifications, Elisande merely mentioned in passing, as if thinking aloud, that she'd heard mill wheels were turning slower this year, that flour was already dear, that hungry people sometimes made unfortunate choices. The proposal was quietly withdrawn, revised, presented again in a form that spread the burden more evenly. She never commanded, never demanded, never raised her voice above the level of wind through leaves. Instead, she would appear in unexpected places at unexpected times. In the kitchens before dawn, where servants gathered to start the day's work. In the stables where grooms spoke freely while brushing horses. In the market square where merchants complained about things they'd never mention. In the castle's great hall. The kingdom began to change in ways so gradual that no one could say exactly when or how it happened. New wells appeared in villages that had struggled with drought, but no one could remember who had ordered them dug. Trade routes shifted slightly, avoiding territories where bandits had grown bold, though no official proclamation had been made. Judges began showing more mercy to debtors. Guards became less quick to draw steel. Tax collectors started accepting payment in goods when coin was scarce. Lord Aldrich, the kingdom's treasurer, would sometimes find suggestions written in Elisande's careful hand, left on his desk like gifts. They were never orders, always phrased as wonderings. I wonder if the northern villages might pay their portion after harvest rather than before. Or perhaps the monastery's excess grain could be purchased for winter distribution. He would study these notes, initially dismissing them, then reconsidering, then discovering that following her gentle guidance somehow made his own work easier, like finding a current that carried his boat rather than fought against it. Young Prince Adrian grew under his mother's quiet guidance like a plant in a greenhouse, protected but not confined, nurtured but not weakened. She taught him to listen before speaking, to watch before acting, to understand that true strength often wore the disguise of gentleness. In the evenings, while fire crackled low in the hearth and shadows danced soft patterns on stone walls, she would Tell him stories of rulers from distant lands and ancient times. But always the heroes were those who built rather than destroyed, who planted rather than raised, who whispered rather than shouted. The castle itself began to reflect Elisander's touch, though again, no one could point to exactly when the changes occurred. Tapestries appeared depicting not battles but harvests, not conquests but celebrations. Windows were opened that had been sealed for generations, letting in air that carried the scent of gardens where herbs grew alongside roses. Practical beauty intertwined with pure ornament. The great hall's rushes were changed more frequently, mixed with lavender and rosemary that released their fragrance when stepped upon, making even winter gatherings smell faintly of summer. In her 7th year as regent, when Adrian was 10 and beginning to show the thoughtful intelligence his mother had cultivated, a crisis arose that threatened to undo all the quiet progress of the previous years. The neighboring kingdom of Westmarch, ruled by King Godfrey, whose voice could be heard 3 rooms away when he was merely conversing, demanded passage through Elisander's realm for his army, seeking to attack enemies farther east. The council was divided, some arguing that resistance was impossible, others insisting that allowing foreign armies to march through would set a precedent that invited future invasions. Voices rose in the council chamber. Fists struck tables. Accusations flew like arrows in a battle neither side could win. Elisander sat through it all, still as a pool reflecting sky, until the arguing exhausted itself. Then she spoke, suggesting, wondering. What if they offered King Godfrey something he wanted more than military passage? She had heard, through channels too delicate to name, that his daughter suffered from a wasting illness no physician could cure, that he would give half his kingdom for her recovery. It happened that in Elisande's realm, in a monastery tucked into mountains where clouds caught on peaks like wool on thorns, there lived a healer whose knowledge of herbs exceeded anyone in 3 kingdoms. Not a miracle worker, nothing that would attract unwanted attention from church authorities, but someone who understood how certain plants could strengthen the body's own desire to heal. The negotiation that followed was conducted entirely through written messages. Elisander's careful script offering not confrontation but collaboration. Within 2 months, King Godfrey's daughter was recovering, color returning to her cheeks like spring returning to frozen ground, and the king's armies found another route to their enemies, one that required no passage through Elisande's peaceful realm. As Adrian approached his 14th year, growing tall but retaining the thoughtful quietness his mother had instilled, Elisander began preparing for the transition of power. But this too she did with such subtlety that the kingdom barely noticed the shift. She included Adrian in council meetings, but had him sit where she had sat, slightly apart, observing. She had him review documents, but always with her notes attached. Gentle suggestions that taught him to see beyond the obvious. The harvest festival of Adrian's 15th year, when he would officially assume the throne, approached like a distant thunder that never quite becomes a storm throughout the kingdom. There was an odd mixture of anticipation and something almost like regret, as if people were realizing they were about to lose something they'd never quite admitted they valued. The ceremony itself took place as autumn light slanted through cathedral windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, like the whole world was being preserved in honey. Adrian spoke his vows in a voice that carried his mother's gentleness but added his own quiet strength. And when he took the crown, Elisander stepped back into shadows with such grace, it seemed she had always belonged there. But stepping back didn't mean disappearing. Not entirely. She took rooms in the castle's oldest tower, where windows faced all four directions and stairs spiraled up like thoughts ascending toward understanding. There she continued what she had always done, listening, watching, occasionally leaving those gentle notes that found their way to her son's desk, to his advisor's chambers, to places where small adjustments could prevent large problems. The kingdom prospered under Adrian's rule, but it was a prosperity built on foundations Elisander had laid, stone by stone, whisper by whisper, in all those years when she ruled without seeming to rule at all. Trade flourished because trust had been cultivated. Borders remained peaceful because neighbors had been helped rather than threatened. Harvests were abundant because farmers felt secure enough to plant for next year rather than hoarding for tomorrow. Sometimes, in early morning, when mist rose from the valley like the earth's dreams taking form, servants would see Elisande walking the castle walls, her grey cloak making her almost invisible against stone and sky. She would pause at each tower, looking out over the kingdom she had shaped through patience rather than force, through understanding rather than demanding. And perhaps she smiled, though in that soft light it was hard to tell where expression ended and shadow began. Years flowed by like a river that seems still on the surface but carries everything gently toward the sea. Adrian married a princess from the southern reaches, a young woman whose laughter rang like silver bells but who also understood the value of silence, of listening, of the spaces between words where real meaning often lived. Together they had children who grew up knowing their grandmother as a presence both constant and ethereal, someone who was always there when needed but never imposed. Elisander aged as she had lived, quietly, gradually, like autumn approaching so slowly you don't notice the leaves changing until suddenly the world is transformed. Her hair shifted from brown to grey to white with such subtlety that no one could remember when the change occurred. Her movements grew slower, but no less purposeful, like a river that has found its final course and feels no need to hurry toward the sea. In what would be her last winter, though no one knew it at the time. Not even Elisande herself. She spent long hours in the castle library, organizing the collection her father-in-law had neglected. Her own father would have treasured. She left notes in the margins of certain books, gentle observations that future readers would discover like unexpected gifts. Thoughts about governance that never used words like power or control, but spoke instead of gardens, of water, of the way morning light touched different surfaces at different angles. The scribes who would later try to record her life found themselves strangely frustrated. There were no great battles to describe, no dramatic proclamations to quote, no single moments when history pivoted on her actions. Instead, there were thousands of small choices, tiny adjustments, whispered suggestions that had accumulated like snowflakes until the entire landscape was transformed. But who could write the history of snow? Each flake mattering, but no single one definable. She passed in early spring, when the last snow was melting and the first flowers were pushing through earth that was still cold but no longer frozen. Adrian found her in her tower room, seated in her favorite chair, facing east, where dawn was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of pearl and rose. She looked as if she was simply sleeping, or perhaps watching something in the distance that only she could see, something beautiful enough to hold her attention forever. The funeral was attended by everyone and no one. The cathedral was full, but the ceremony was quiet, voices never rising above the level of a gentle rain. Even the bells seemed to ring more softly, as if they too had learned Elisande's lesson that true power whispered rather than shouted, that influence flowed like water, finding its way into every space without forcing any door. But here's the strange thing about Elisande's story. The thing that makes historians set down their pens in gentle frustration. Within a generation, maybe two, her name began to fade from official records, not erased, nothing so dramatic, but simply overlooked. Chronicles would mention King Adrian the Wise, would praise his peaceful reign, his prosperous kingdom, his gift for diplomacy. But his mother, the woman who had shaped him, shaped the kingdom, shaped an entire way of thinking about power. She became a footnote, then a margin note, then barely a whisper. Yet her influence continued, spreading like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Ripples that continued long after the stone itself had disappeared from view. The kingdom's tradition of quiet governance, of listening before speaking, of building rather than breaking. All of this continued through generations who couldn't have said where these traditions began. They were simply the way things were done, as natural as breathing, as inevitable as morning following night. Other kingdoms, watching from a distance, would sometimes send emissaries to learn the secret of this realm's strange peace, its ability to prosper without conquest, to grow strong without growing hard. The emissaries would return confused, reporting that there was no secret, no special system, just a quality in the air, like a perfume too subtle to name but impossible to ignore. They spoke of councils where silence was valued as much as speech, of castles where servants smiled genuinely, of markets where merchants competed through generosity rather than greed. In monasteries where history was kept, monks would sometimes find references to Queen Elisande in the margins of other stories, always peripheral, never central, like catching a glimpse of someone important from the corner of your eye. But when you turn to look directly, they've already passed. She appeared in account books, in letters between merchants, in the diary of a traveling minstrel who mentioned a queen so quiet he wasn't sure if he had dreamed her. The tower where she had spent her final years became known simply as the Quiet Tower, though few remembered why it was called that. Birds nested in its eaves, particularly doves whose soft calls seemed to suit the space. The stairs still spiraled upward, worn smooth by countless feet, leading to rooms where dust motes danced in afternoon light like memories too gentle to quite disappear. Sometimes, very occasionally, a young person would climb those stairs, drawn by something they couldn't name, and find one of Elisande's books still open to a page where her notes waited in margins, patient as seeds. They would read her careful words about the nature of influence, how it was like water that shaped stone not through force but through persistence, how the greatest changes were often invisible until they were complete, how silence could be more powerful than any proclamation if it was the right kind of silence, full rather than empty, pregnant with possibility rather than void of thought. These young people would descend the stairs changed in ways they couldn't quite articulate, carrying something new in their hearts, or perhaps something very old that had been waiting to be remembered. They would go on to live lives that seemed ordinary, but somehow their choices would ripple outward, affecting others in subtle ways, creating patterns that no historian would ever trace, but that shaped the world nonetheless. The kingdom itself gradually forgot it had ever been ruled by a queen who spoke in whispers. Its prosperity became simply its nature, like a garden that has been tended so long and so well that everyone assumes it grew that way naturally. The trade routes Elisande had carefully cultivated became traditional paths, worn into the landscape like rivers that seemed to have always flowed just so. The alliances she had nurtured through small kindnesses became friendships between kingdoms that felt as old as the mountains themselves. Even the way people spoke to each other in this realm carried her influence, though none knew it. Voices rarely rose in anger. Arguments were conducted like dances where partners moved together rather than against each other. Children were taught to listen before speaking, to watch before acting, to understand that the space between words could carry as much meaning as the words themselves. In the great hall where council still met, Elisande's chair remained. Though it had been moved slightly over the years, pushed back into shadows where it gathered dust like silence, gathering thoughts. No one sat in it, not out of reverence, for most had forgotten who had once occupied it, but because it didn't seem quite right somehow, as if the chair itself preferred to observe rather than participate. The gardens she had cultivated still grew, though the gardeners who tended them didn't know that the pattern of paths, the choice of plants, the way roses climb the walls in certain places but not others, all of this had been guided by a queen who understood that beauty and utility could intertwine like lovers' hands, inseparable and stronger together than apart. Her son Adrian ruled for 40 years, a reign remembered as a golden age, though no gold was conquered, no enemies defeated in glorious battle, no monuments raised to proclaim greatness. Instead, children grew to adulthood without knowing hunger. Merchants traveled roads without fear of bandits. Farmers planted with confidence that their crops would feed their families rather than armies. It was a greatness so gentle that it didn't register as greatness at all, just life as it should be lived. When Adrian finally passed, full of years and surrounded by grandchildren who had known only peace, he was buried beside his mother in the castle's small cemetery where willows bent over stones worn smooth by rain and time. His stone was elaborate, carved with crowns and swords and all the symbols of kingship, while Elisande's was simple, just her name and dates, though even these were becoming hard to read as moss crept across the surface like time itself claiming what belonged to it. But on certain mornings, when mist rose from the valleys and wrapped around the castle like memories made visible, servants would swear they could hear something in the Towers, not quite footsteps, not quite voices, but a presence, patient and watchful, like someone still tending to a kingdom that had forgotten it was being tended to. The stories that survived about Elisande were never the official ones. They lived in lullabies. Mothers sang without knowing where the melodies came from. In sayings, grandfathers repeated without remembering who had first said them. In the way certain flowers were planted beside certain herbs in gardens throughout the realm. Patterns repeated because they felt right, though no one could say why. A merchant's daughter, learning her letters, might find in an old account book a note in fading ink about Queen Elisande's preference for paying in advance rather than demanding credit. And something about that small detail would lodge in her mind, affecting how she would later conduct her own business, with trust extended like a hand across water. A young lord, thrust into governance before he felt ready, might discover in his father's papers a letter from long ago, signed with a name he didn't recognize, suggesting that power was like breath, most effective when you weren't conscious of it, most necessary when it seemed most natural. He would puzzle over this, but find himself returning to it when difficult decisions arose, letting the wisdom settle into his bones like warmth from a distant fire. The neighboring kingdoms, those that had once viewed Elisande's realm with puzzlement or condescension, gradually found themselves adopting similar practices, not through conquest or coercion, but through a kind of osmosis, like plants turning toward light without deciding to do so. Their counsels grew quieter, their justice more merciful, their strength less brittle and more flexible, like trees that bend with storm winds rather than break in against them. Scholars who try to trace these changes back to their source found themselves lost in a maze of influences so subtle, connections so delicate, that it was like trying to map the path of incense smoke as it dispersed through a great hall. They could see the effects, the gradual transformation of an entire region's approach to governance, but the cause remained elusive, hidden in margins and shadows and the spaces between official history. The fortress of Westmarch, where King Godfrey had once ruled with a voice like thunder, gradually became known for its library rather than its armory. No one could say exactly when the change had begun, but it might have been when Godfrey's daughter recovered from her illness through Elisande's quiet intervention, grew up to marry a scholar who whispered rather than shouted, who built with words rather than swords. Trade routes that Elisande had influenced through suggestion rather than decree became the arteries through which not just goods but ideas flowed, carrying concepts of governance that privileged patience over haste, understanding over dominance, the long view over the immediate gain. Merchants became unwitting ambassadors of a philosophy they couldn't name, but embodied in every transaction conducted with trust rather than suspicion. In the monasteries where knowledge was preserved like seeds saved against future need, scribes would sometimes pause in their copying, having written Elisande's name almost without thinking, as if it belonged in the story they were telling even though the original text hadn't mentioned her. They would consider erasing it, but something would stay their hand, and so her name would slip into history sideways. A shadow cast by light no one could quite locate. The quiet tower still stood, would always stand as long as the castle itself endured. its windows facing all directions, watching over a kingdom that had forgotten it was being watched over. The books she had annotated were gradually moved to other parts of the library, their margins growing faint as ink faded like memory, but never quite disappearing entirely. Children playing in the castle, generations removed from anyone who had known Elisander, would sometimes claim they had seen a lady in grey walking the battlements in early morning, her cloak flowing like mist, her face kind but indistinct as if seen through water. Their parents would smile, dismissing it as imagination, but secretly wondering why so many children over so many years described the same gentle presence. The roses in the garden still climbed the walls where she had trained them, following paths established by hands that had long since returned to earth. But roses remember in their own way, through root and thorn and bloom, carrying forward patterns that speak of patience and purpose combined, of beauty that serves and service that beautifies. As our story begins to fade, like twilight spreading across the land, we can see how Elisander's influence continues even now, in this very moment, in the way these words have been whispered rather than proclaimed, in the spaces between sentences where breath naturally falls, in the gentle insistence that power and gentleness need not be opposites but can be woven together like silk threads, each making the other stronger. Her kingdom prospers still, though maps might call it by different names now, borders having shifted like sand dunes, reshaped by patient winds. But something essential remains, something in the quality of light that falls across those valleys, something in the way morning mist rises from rivers that remember her reflection, something in the very air that speaks of a presence both gone and eternal. The historians have largely given up trying to capture her story, recognizing perhaps that some influences are too pervasive to document, like trying to write the biography of rain, essential to everything that grows but impossible to separate from the growth itself. She has become less a person in history and more a quality of history, a reminder that the greatest changes often happen so slowly, so gently, that we only notice them when we look back and realize the entire world has transformed. In the great cathedral where she was married, where she attended her husband's funeral, where she watched her son crowned, there is a window that no one remembers commissioning. It doesn't depict any scene exactly, just patterns of light that shift with the hours, sometimes seeming to show a woman's face, sometimes just abstract beauty, sometimes nothing at all but colored light falling on stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The kingdom's archives contain thousands of documents from her time as regent, but her signature appears on remarkably few. Instead, there are endless small notes, suggestions, wonderings, written in a hand so gentle it seems the ink barely touched the paper, as if even her writing was afraid of leaving too deep a mark. And yet these whispers of ink changed more than any bold proclamation could have. The tradition continues, passed down not through conscious teaching but through something deeper. The way children learn to speak by hearing speech, learn to walk by seeing others walk. Young rulers in this realm still find themselves pausing before making decisions, listening to a silence that seems full of wisdom, considering approaches that privilege subtlety over force, though they couldn't say why this feels right, only that it does. The merchant guilds still meet in halls where voices rarely rise above conversational levels, where agreements are reached through patient negotiation rather than aggressive bargaining. The courts still favor mercy tempered with justice rather than justice stripped of mercy. The armies, when they must exist, still think first of defense rather than conquest, of protecting rather than taking. All of this, every gentle tradition, every quiet strength, every patient wisdom can be traced back to a queen who ruled in whispers, who understood that true power doesn't announce itself but simply is, like gravity, like breath, like the way morning always follows night, no matter how long the darkness seems. And perhaps, in the end, this is her greatest victory, that she changed the world so thoroughly, so gently, that the world forgot it had been changed. Her influence became like water that has carved a canyon so slowly that those who live there assume the landscape was always thus, never knowing that once there was solid rock where now a river flows. The stars are wheeling overhead now, following paths as old as time itself. And somewhere in their patterns, if you know how to look, you might see the outline of a crown made not of gold but of gathered starlight. Not proclaimed but suggested. Not demanding attention but receiving it. Nonetheless, from those who understand that the greatest queens are often those whose names history can barely remember. In the villages that dot the valleys below the castle, fires are being banked for the night. Children are being tucked into beds with lullabies that carry traces of Elisande's influence, though the singers don't know it. The words speak of gentle strength, of patient wisdom, of the way small kindnesses can change the world if given time enough to grow. The castle itself is settling into sleep, stones cooling after the day's warmth, releasing their heat slowly back to the night air like sighs of contentment. In the quiet tower, shadows gather in corners like memories pooling in the margins of consciousness. And perhaps, if you listen very carefully, you can hear something that might be footsteps, or might be heartbeats, or might just be time itself, marking its patient passage. The moon has risen now, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow, making the hard edges of day soften into something more forgiving. This is the light Elisande loved best, when the world revealed its gentler nature, when even stone walls looked soft as wool, when distances became suggestions rather than facts. Her story is almost told now, though in truth it never really ends, just transforms, like energy that can neither be created nor destroyed, only passed from one form to another. Every time someone chooses patience over haste, every time power is exercised with restraint rather than abandon, every time a whisper accomplishes what a shout could not, Elisande's story continues. The scribes have long since set down their quills, the historians have closed their chronicles. But in the spaces between written words, in the margins of official history, in the quiet moments when no one is watching or recording, her influence persists, patient as stone, gentle as rain, inevitable as the seasons turning their great wheel. Tomorrow, when dawn comes creeping across the mountains, painting the castle walls gold and rose, someone will walk the battlements and feel, without knowing why, that they are not alone. Someone will find one of her books and read her notes and carry forward ideas that seem both new and ancient. Someone will choose kindness over cruelty, patience over haste, listening over speaking, and never know they are continuing a tradition started by a queen whose name they've never heard. The kingdom sleeps now, wrapped in a peace so deep it doesn't know it's peaceful. Just as fish don't know they're wet. Just as we don't feel the earth spinning beneath us at 1,000 miles an hour. This is Elisande's true monument. Not stone or bronze or words carved deep, but a quality of living that has become so natural it seems it must have always been. And so, her story becomes part of the night's gentle tapestry, woven through with silver, threads of moonlight and the softest whispers of wind through ancient stones. If you're still listening, perhaps another tale awaits in tomorrow's twilight, or perhaps just peaceful sleep, where queens made of whispers and kingdoms built of kindness drift through dreams as soft as swan's down, as quiet as snow falling on water, as eternal as the space between one breath and the next. The night deepens around us now, like a blanket being pulled slowly higher. And in this gentle darkness, there are more whispers to be found. More traces of Elisander that flutter at the edges of sleeping consciousness, like butterflies made of moonlight that only appear when we're not quite looking. In a village 3 valleys away from the castle, where shepherds tend flocks that move across hillsides like clouds casting shadows on earth, there lives an old woman who swears her grandmother once served in the castle, though served might be too strong a word, attended perhaps, or simply existed near, like a flower that happens to bloom beside a path. This old woman, whose name is Margot, though she's been called so many things over the years that names seem less important than the knowing of her, sits by her fire on nights like this, when cold makes the stars seem closer, and tells stories to children who aren't sure if they're awake or already dreaming. She speaks of a queen who could hear the grass growing, who could taste tomorrow's weather in today's wind, who knew which herbs would bring sleep and which would bring dreams and which would bring that gentle space between the two where healing happens. Her voice is soft as wool being carded, rhythmic as a wheel spinning thread, and the children's eyes grow heavy, while still trying to hold on to her words. The stories Margot tells aren't the ones written in any chronicle. They're smaller than that, and therefore larger, like how a single seed contains an entire forest if you just add time and patience. She tells of how Queen Elisande would walk through the kitchens before dawn, not inspecting, never that, but simply being present, the way morning mist is present, touching everything lightly, changing nothing obviously, yet somehow making the bread rise higher, the soup taste richer, the servants feel seen even in their invisibility. One story, told so softly that listeners have to lean close enough to smell the lavender Margot keeps in her pockets, is about a winter when snow fell so deep that paths disappeared, when villages were cut off like islands in a white sea. The castle storerooms were full, but the villages were struggling, their own stores running low as the snow continued, falling, like the sky had decided to empty itself completely. The lords of the council met in rooms where fires roared, but couldn't quite chase away the cold. They spoke of waiting for spring, of the natural order of things, of how helping too much would create dependence. Their words were practical, sensible, carrying the kind of wisdom that sounds right until you're the one hungry in the cold. But Elisander, who had sat silent through these discussions, silent as the snow itself, began something different. Something so quiet that no one noticed at first. She had the castle's weavers create blankets, but not just any blankets, ones woven with patterns that told stories, that carried warmth beyond the merely physical. And these blankets found their way to villages, carried by servants who couldn't quite remember being asked to deliver them, only knowing that it felt right. With the blankets came other things, small things, a handful of grain here, a pot of preserved fruit there, never enough to be called charity, which would have stung proud people's pride, but just enough to be called sharing, which made everyone feel part of something larger. The patterns in those blankets, Margot says, her fingers tracing shapes in the air that the firelight turns to shadow puppets, became traditional in these valleys. Mothers learned to weave them without knowing why those particular designs felt right. Only that they did, like lullabies sung in languages no longer understood but still carrying their original comfort. Even now, generations later, if you know where to look, you can find those patterns worked into wedding shawls, baby blankets, shrouds that wrap the dead in their final sleep. Always the same motifs. Spirals that speak of seasons returning, interconnected knots that show how all things are woven together, borders that look like walls but on closer inspection are revealed to be doorways. Margot's voice has grown softer now, as if she's talking to herself, or to the fire, or to something that exists in the space between waking and sleeping. She speaks of how Elisander understood that influence was like fragrance, strongest when barely noticed, most memorable when you can't quite name its source. The children around Margot's fire have all fallen asleep now, their breathing synchronized, like they're sharing the same dream. And perhaps they are. Perhaps they're dreaming of a castle where shadows are friendly and silence is full, where a queen walks through rooms leaving traces of lavender and kindness, where power means the ability to help others become powerful in their own quiet ways. Back in the castle, in rooms that have been empty for so long that dust has become part of their character, something stirs, not wind, for the windows have been sealed for winter, not mice, for even they prefer warmer spaces, but something. Perhaps just the weight of memory itself, shifting and settling like an old house adjusting to temperature changes. In what was once Elisander's private study, a room so small it might have been a large closet, there remains a desk where she wrote her endless notes. The wood is dark with age now, polished by countless hands, though no one remembers whose. In one drawer, if anyone thought to look, which they don't, lie sheets of parchment covered in her handwriting. But the ink has faded so much that the words seem more suggested than stated, like thoughts that haven't quite decided to become real. One page, if held to candlelight at just the right angle, reveals what might be a poem, or might be a prayer, or might be simply observations arranged in lines that look like poetry because of how they break. It speaks of water finding its level, of seeds sleeping in darkness before they know to grow, of how the strongest walls are the ones that know when to have gates. But reading it is like trying to hold water in your hands, possible for a moment, but ultimately the meaning flows through your fingers, leaving only the sensation of having touched something important. The castle's current inhabitants, the great great grandchildren of those who knew Elisande, live their lives unaware of her presence, yet shaped by it nonetheless. The young prince, Adrian's descendant, rules with a gentleness he assumes comes from his father, who assumed it came from his father, who assumed it came from nature itself, never knowing it was cultivated like a garden across generations. The servants move through the castle with a particular grace, not subservient but participatory, as if they're all part of some grand dance whose steps were choreographed so long ago that everyone assumes they're natural. They speak in low voices not because they're forced to, but because it feels appropriate. Like speaking loudly in these halls would be like shouting in a library or a forest grove, in the treasury, where gold and silver are counted and recounted. There's a tradition of leaving one coin uncounted, always one, set aside in a small box that no one opens, no one questions. The treasurers think it's for luck, but really it's the continuation of something Elisande started. A reminder that no accounting is ever complete, that there's always something beyond our calculations, something that escapes our need to measure and control. The garden where she once walked has evolved, as gardens do, plants dying and being replaced, paths shifting slightly with each generation's footsteps. But something essential remains, a quality of invitation, as if the garden wants you to enter, wants you to slow down, wants you to notice things you usually overlook. There's a bench there, stone worn smooth, where Elisande used to sit in the evening, watching the sun paint the mountains in colors that have no names, just feelings. The bench is still there, though few use it. There's something about it that makes people want to be quiet, to listen, though if asked what they're listening for, they couldn't say. Sometimes, very rarely, when conditions are exactly right, when the moon is dark and stars are bright and mist rises from the valley like the earth's own dreams, someone sitting on that bench might hear something. Not words, nothing so clear as that, but a presence in the silence, like when you know someone is in a room with you even though your eyes are closed. The archives beneath the castle, where records are kept in rooms that smell of old paper and forgotten ink, contain thousands of documents that mention Elisande, but always obliquely. She appears in margins, in postscripts, in the spaces between official business, like someone standing just outside the frame of a painting. Influential to the scene, but not quite part of it. A scholar, working late by candlelight that makes shadows dance like living things, might notice her name appearing in strange patterns. Here in a grain report, there in a diplomatic correspondence, here again in a mason's bill for repairs. Never central, always peripheral, but somehow essential, like breathing is to speech, unnoticed but necessary. The pattern of her influence is like looking at stars. The more directly you stare, the less you see. But if you look slightly away, let your peripheral vision take over. Suddenly the patterns emerge, constellations of connection that map something vast and gentle. In the monastery where that healer lived, the one who saved King Godfrey's daughter, there's a garden of medicinal herbs that still follows the plan Elisander suggested in one of her gentle letters. The monks who tend it don't know this. They think the garden has always been arranged just so, with the poisonous plants that can heal in small doses planted next to their antidotes, with paths that force you to slow down and observe before harvesting. The recipes for tinctures and tisanes that the monastery is famous for. They all include unnecessary steps, moments of waiting that don't seem to affect the medicine's potency. But these pauses, these moments of patience built into the process, they change the maker, teach them something about time and attention that can't be learned any other way. The merchant routes that Elisande influenced, through suggestions so subtle they seemed like observations about weather. These paths have become roads, have become traditions, have become the very arteries of commerce in this part of the world. Traders follow them without question, the way birds follow migration routes written in their bones. Along these routes, in inns where travelers rest, there are customs that seem as old as the buildings themselves. The first cup of wine is always watered, making it last longer, making conversation stretch out rather than burst forth. The best room is given to whoever needs it most, not whoever can pay the most, though somehow the innkeepers never go hungry. These traditions spread like seeds on wind, carried to places Elisande never knew existed, taking root in souls that never heard her name, growing into practices that seem to have emerged naturally, locally, obviously. Though their DNA traces back to a castle on a hill and a queen who understood that the best way to change everything is to seem to change nothing. The night is deep now, so deep that it's beginning to thin at the edges, though dawn is still hours away. That particular time when sleep is heaviest, when dreams are most real, when the boundary between what was and what might be becomes permeable as mist. In this deep time, Elisande's presence is strongest, or perhaps it's just that our resistance to subtle things is weakest. Either way, if you were to walk the castle now, in these hours when even shadows sleep, you might feel her more clearly than any historian ever could. You might feel her in the way the corridors seem to guide your steps, gently, never forcing. But somehow, you end up where you need to be. You might sense her in the way certain doors open more easily than others, inviting you into some rooms while suggesting, without insisting, that others should remain closed. The castle itself has become her body in a way, her influence soaked into stone like centuries of rain. Every room holds something of her, not objects. Those have long since crumbled or been cleared away, but something more lasting, an approach to space, a way of being in rooms that makes them more than mere containers. The great hall, where once loud feasts rang with boasting and discord, now hosts gatherings where music is played softly and conversations flow like brooks over stones. The kitchen, where she walked in those pre-dawn hours, still feels welcoming to anyone who enters, no matter their station, as if the room itself remembers her democracy of kindness. Her influence extends beyond the castle, beyond the kingdom, rippling outward in waves that grow fainter but never quite disappear, like how a stone thrown in a pond creates ripples that eventually reach the shore. Changed and gentle, but still carrying the energy of that first contact. In distant courts, Queens and princesses who have never heard Elisande's name find themselves drawn to quieter forms of power. Discover that listening gains them more than speaking. Learn that patience can be a form of strength that outlasts any violence. The stories told to children in lands far from here. They've changed too. Heroes are quieter now. Victories more subtle. The dragons that must be defeated are more often internal than external. And the wise women in these tales, they're usually grey-cloaked, soft-spoken, appearing at edges of important moments rather than centers. Even the way history itself is recorded has shifted. Chronicles now include more daily details, more attention to the lives of common people, more recognition that great events are often the culmination of countless small choices rather than single dramatic moments. Historians don't know why they've started recording things this way. It just seems more complete, more true. But we are drifting now, far from the castle, far from Margot's fire, far from the concrete into something altogether more gossamer. This is what happens to Elisande's story when you follow it too far. It dissipates like mist in morning sun, becomes part of everything, and therefore impossible to separate out as one thing. Back in the quiet tower, where her presence is still most concentrated, though concentrated isn't quite right. Perhaps distilled is better, or essence, or simply most itself. The air holds a quality of waiting without impatience, of patience without resignation, of strength that doesn't need to prove itself. If you climbed those stairs now, your footsteps would sound like whispers, not because you're trying to be quiet, but because the tower itself encourages softness. The handrail worn smooth by countless hands would guide you up, spiraling like thoughts ascending toward understanding. At the top, in the room where she spent her last years, her last days, her last breath, the windows still face all four directions. Though the glass is old now, wavering, making the world outside look like a watercolor painting where edges blend and certainties become suggestions. The chair where she sat is still there, though no one knows it was hers. It's become just part of the room, like a rock in a garden that's been there so long it seems to have grown from the earth itself. Sometimes sunlight falls across it in a way that makes it glow, warm and inviting. But no one sits there. It doesn't feel like their place. On the windowsill, barely visible unless you know to look, are marks where she used to rest her hand while gazing out. The stone is worn slightly, polished by years of gentle contact, a testament to patience that even stone remembers. As our story begins to fade completely now, dissolving into the night, like sugar into warm water, becoming part of something larger than itself, we can see how Elisande achieved the rarest form of immortality. She became not a memory but a way of remembering. Not a presence but a quality of presence. Her name may be forgotten, will be forgotten, has already been mostly forgotten. But names are just sounds we make, labels we attach to things too complex to truly capture. What she was, what she is, what she continues to be, transcends naming. She is in the pause before speaking, when someone chooses their words carefully. She is in the moment when strength decides not to use itself, when power realizes it's most powerful when shared. She is in every garden tended with patience, every child raised with gentle firmness, every decision made with tomorrow's tomorrow in mind. The kingdom sleeps on, deeply now, carried by rhythms she helped establish, breathing with a peace she helped cultivate, dreaming dreams that her quiet work made possible. And if the kingdom doesn't know her name, doesn't remember her face, doesn't acknowledge her influence, well, that too is as she would have wanted. For Elisander understood something that most rulers never learn, that the greatest power is the kind that makes itself unnecessary. That true influence is what remains after you're gone. Not monuments or memories, but the changed shape of the world itself. Subtle as the way rivers slowly carve valleys. Patient as the way forests reclaim abandoned fields. Gentle as the way morning always comes. The stars are wheeling toward dawn now, though darkness still holds the world in its soft embrace. And somewhere, in the space between sleeping and waking, between history and legend, between memory and dream, Elisande continues her work, still listening, still influencing, still showing anyone who cares to notice that strength and gentleness are not opposites but partners in the long dance of time. And so, her story becomes part of the night's gentle tapestry, woven so thoroughly into the fabric of sleep that you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. If you're still listening, perhaps another tale awaits in tomorrow's gloaming, or perhaps just peaceful sleep, where queens made of whispers and wisdom drift like smoke from dying embers, soft as forgetting, gentle as remembering, quiet as the space between one heartbeat and the next, and the next, fading now, fading, into the welcoming darkness where all stories eventually find their rest. The darkness holds us now like water holds a sleeping stone, completely, gently, with no urgency to be anywhere else. And in this deep embrace, even the memory of Elisander becomes something softer than memory, something that exists in the place where thoughts go when we're not thinking them, where dreams wait before they become dreams. Far away, so far that distance loses meaning. Church bells are beginning to consider ringing. Not yet, not for hours yet, but beginning to gather themselves for that eventual moment when they'll call the world back to waking. Though here, in this space we've created together, their future sound is just another layer of quiet, like knowing rain will come eventually, but right now the clouds are still gathering, still thinking about whether they want to release what they're holding. The castle stones are at their coolest now, having released all yesterday's warmth into the night, waiting patiently for tomorrow's sun to find them again, to warm them again, to continue the cycle that has been repeating since before Elisander, during Elisander, after Elisander, making her time seem both eternal and momentary, like a single breath in the castle's long life, in the villages scattered through the valleys, like seeds thrown by a gentle hand. People are deep in their third sleep, that profound rest that comes just before dawn, when the body repairs itself in ways we don't understand, when the mind sorts through everything it's gathered, keeping what matters, letting go of what doesn't. Though who decides what matters is one of those mysteries that Elisander would have smiled at, knowing that some questions are better left floating. Her influence has become like the influence of water on stone, so slow, so patient, that you could watch for a lifetime and never see it happening. Yet somehow, given enough time, entire landscapes are transformed, Mountains become valleys. Valleys become rivers. Rivers become the memories of rivers. And still the water continues its patient work. There's a merchant sleeping now in an inn, 3 kingdoms away, his dreams full of numbers that don't quite add up, but in a good way, like when generosity makes the math work differently. He doesn't know that his grandfather's grandfather once received a letter sealed with Elisande's mark, suggesting ever so gently that trust given often returns threefold, though not always in ways we can count. The letter is long gone, turned to dust, fed to fire. But its message continues in the way this merchant always rounds down his prices just a little, always extends credit just a day longer, always finds that somehow, mysteriously, his coffers never empty. The influence spreads like rings in water, but also like roots underground. Invisible networks connecting everything to everything else in ways that would look like chaos if we could see them all at once. But because we can only ever see small pieces, they look like coincidence, like luck, like the natural order of things asserting itself. A young mother, rocking her baby in arms that ache with tiredness but won't put the child down. Not yet, is humming a melody she learned from her mother, who learned it from her mother, who learned it from someone whose name is lost. The melody has words, but she's forgotten them. Remembers only something about shadows being friends and silence being full and queens who might be clouds or might be dreams or might be both. The baby settles, finally, deeply, and the mother keeps humming, softer now. So soft it's more vibration than sound, more feeling than music. And something in that barely there melody carries Elisande's understanding that the smallest influences are often the strongest. That what we give to one sleeping child ripples outward through generations. Back in the castle, in rooms that haven't been opened in so long that opening them would feel like archaeology. There are things Elisande touched that still exist, transformed by time, but somehow still holding something of her. A spindle she used when young, learning that the thread must be neither too tight nor too loose. A book she read until its binding gave way, held together now by ribbon that might once have been blue. A single glove, the other, long lost, that still holds the shape of a hand that was both strong and gentle. These objects don't matter in themselves. They're just things. Matter organized temporarily into forms that will eventually dissolve. But they serve as anchor points for something harder to define. Nodes in an invisible web where her influence still gathers, still pulses, still sends out waves too subtle for any instrument to measure. The night is thinning now at its edges, though the center still holds deep and dark, like ink diluted with water, still colored but growing more transparent, more permeable to the coming day, though day is still just a promise, just a possibility, waiting its turn, in the quiet tower, where we have spent so much of our time tonight. Something is happening that happens every night, but no one ever sees. The temperature is dropping just enough that dew is forming on the windows. Tiny drops of water that catch starlight and hold it. Millions of tiny lenses that will disappear as soon as the sun finds them. But for now they're perfect, each one a small world. Each one reflecting everything while being almost nothing itself. This is what Elisande understood about power, that it could be like these dewdrops, barely there but everywhere, changing how light moves through the world without anyone noticing the medium of change. And when the sun comes, when the dew evaporates, no one mourns its passing because no one noticed it was there. Yet everything was slightly different because of it, slightly softer, slightly more beautiful. The guards who walk the castle walls, changing shift in these deep hours, move with a particular rhythm that they've never questioned. 7 steps along this wall, pause, listen. 14 steps to the corner, pause, turn, listen again. They think they're watching for threats from outside. But really, they're maintaining a pattern Elisande established, not for defense but for meditation, for turning necessary vigilance into something almost like prayer. Each pause is placed where the view is most beautiful, or most peaceful, or most thought-provoking. Each section of wall takes exactly as long to walk as a specific contemplation needs. Though the guards don't know they're contemplating, think they're just walking, just watching, just doing their duty. Yet they arrive at the end of their shift calmer than they began, more centered, more ready for sleep or waking as their schedule demands. This is how deeply her influence has soaked into the stones, into the routines, into the very air of this place. It's not imposed. Nothing she did was ever imposed, but invited, suggested, made available for those who wanted to accept it. Like a door left slightly open that you could push wider or leave as it was, the archives where we found those fragments of her writing, they're quiet now in a way that goes beyond the absence of sound. It's the quiet of knowledge resting, of words waiting to be read, of wisdom that doesn't need to announce itself because it knows that those who need it will find it. Eventually, in their own time, when they're ready. Sometimes scholars working there late into the night report a strange phenomenon. Though they're embarrassed to mention it, and only do so after several cups of wine. They say that sometimes, when they're stuck on a problem, when the documents aren't making sense, when they're about to give up, they'll suddenly notice a document they swear wasn't there before. Always exactly what they needed. Always in Elisande's hand. Though the ink is so faded, it could be imagination. They copy these phantom documents quickly, afraid they'll disappear. But they never do, just sit there, patient as always, until they're no longer needed. And then somehow they're back where they belong, filed in sequences that make sense only if you don't think about them too hard. The influence ripples outward, always outward, like heat from a fire that went out long ago but somehow still warms. In chords where power plays unfold, like elaborate dances, someone will suddenly suggest a quieter approach, not because they've heard of Elisande, but because something in the air makes it seem right. In markets where vendors compete for customers, someone will share a particularly good location, not from weakness, but from strength that doesn't need to hoard. Even in places where violence seems inevitable, where armies face each other across fields that seem destined to be watered with blood, sometimes, just sometimes, someone remembers or invents or discovers the possibility of another way. They step back instead of forward, speak instead of shout, listen instead of demand. And wars that seemed certain dissolve like morning mist, leaving everyone slightly confused about why they were so angry. Like waking from a dream and forgetting what was so urgent about it. The merchant routes she influenced have become more than paths for goods. They're channels for a kind of thinking, a way of being in the world that privileges exchange over hoarding, connection over isolation, the long journey over the quick profit. Caravans stop at wells she had dug, though the diggers have been forgotten. Rest in shadows of trees she had planted, though no one remembers the planting. And in all these places, in all these moments, her influence works like yeast in dough, invisible but essential, changing the very structure of things while seeming to do nothing at all. This is the deepest magic, though it isn't magic, just understanding, patience, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to be strong. We're drifting now. You and I, like boats that have slipped their moorings but aren't concerned about it, knowing the current will carry us where we need to go. The story of Elisande has become less story and more feeling, less narrative and more atmosphere, dissolving into the night like salt into ocean, still there, but no longer separate. Her legacy isn't in books or buildings or bloodlines, though traces exist in all of these. It's in the space between heartbeats where choice lives, in the pause before words where wisdom gathers, in the moment when power chooses not to use itself. These spaces, these pauses, these moments of not doing that accomplish more than any action. This is where she lives still. The kingdom dreams on, held in the gentle hand of night for just a while longer. And in its dreams it remembers without remembering, knows without knowing, that once there was a queen who ruled in whispers, who changed everything by seeming to change nothing, who left no monuments because she became the monument, invisible and everywhere. The stars are fading now, not going away but being overcome by something larger. The way a small light doesn't disappear when you bring it near a larger light but becomes part of it, absorbed into greater brightness. This is how Elisande's story ends. Not with ending, but with becoming part of everything else. No longer distinguishable as itself, but essential to what remains. And so, as the night itself begins to consider morning, as the world prepares to turn its face toward the sun once more, as sleeping minds begin their slow swim up from the depths of dream, her story completes itself by never quite completing, like a circle that's actually a spiral, seeming to close but actually opening into something ever larger. The castle will wake soon, servants stirring, fires being lit, bread being baked, all the ordinary miracles that make a day. And in all of these actions, these simple, necessary movements, something of Elisande continues, patient as breath, gentle as light, quiet as the space between sleeping and waking where we float now, suspended in the last moments of night. And so, her story becomes part of the night's gentle tapestry, woven so fine now that you cannot see the individual threads, only the whole cloth that wraps around us, warm and soft and safe. If you're still listening, perhaps another tale awaits in tomorrow's dusk, or perhaps just peaceful sleep, where queens made of whispers dissolve into dreams, where influence becomes air, where stories end by never ending, just transforming, always transforming, into something quieter, softer, further away, until there's only the rhythm of breath, the whisper of wind, the patient darkness that holds us all safe, safe endlessly, peacefully, safe